Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the autumn 2022 season of the Virtual Museum Lecture Series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous people for millennia, and we'd like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who walked on Turtle Island before us. My name is Kathleen Powell, and I'm the Curator and Supervisor of Historical Services at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us from your screens this evening, whether you're tuning in live or after the fact. A special welcome to any audience members out there who are new to this series. Thank you for joining us. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and spark imagination and exploration of our city's rich history. There's so many ways to join in on the historical fun and get your local history fix. You can view all our past lectures. Oh, I probably should move my slides. You can view all of our past lectures on our YouTube channel playlist, and you can listen to the lecture audio on our podcast, VMLS via podcast, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts under STC Museum Podcasts. As always, please feel free to make use of the chat box to ask questions or send comments. We'll moderate the chat box during and at the end of the presentation. Just remember there's a slight delay in the broadcast, so if we miss your question, we'll get it at the end of the presentation. We so appreciate you joining the lecture series, and we would equally appreciate a donation in support of our programming. Your donation helps us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you have come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 or visit our donation portal on our active STC page to make a donation. Your donation makes a difference, and thank you so much. Before I hand over the mic to this very knowledgeable guest speaker we have this evening, I would like to share our upcoming lectures for the rest of this season. On November 15th, you'll have me delivering a lecture about the interwar period in St. Catharines titled In the Public Public Works in St. Catharines Between the World Wars. On November 29th, a special guest, local historian and chair of the city's Heritage Committee, Brian Nari, will return to the series to give a talk about early settlement in St. Catharines. As you may remember, Brian loves a good title and offers this as the title to his lecture, Ponderous Fraus, Menhirs, and Jaded Farm Horses, or Early St. Catharines Before the First Welland Canal. And finally, we're also happy to welcome back Dr. Kimberly Monk on December 13th to provide an update on her work at the Chicluna Shipyard Dig. After 2 long years away from the site, Dr. Monk will be back on the dig this summer, or was back on the dig this past summer, and we're looking forward to welcoming her back to hear more about this fascinating history. And now I'm happy to welcome tonight's special guest lecturer, Dr. Jonathan Vance. I'm especially thrilled to have him here because from my own more selfish perspective, he wrote a book that is probably one of my favorite history books that I've read. So I'm especially pleased to have him here. Jonathan Vance, PhD, FRSC, is a distinguished university professor and J.B. Smallman Chair in the Department of History at Western University, where he teaches Canadian and military history and social memory. A native of Waterdown, Ontario, he holds degrees from McMaster University, Queen's University, and York University. And he's the author of many books and articles, including Objects of Concern, Canadian Prisoners of War Through the 20th Century, Death So Noble, which I love, Memory, Meaning, and the First World War, and I highly recommend that book. A Gallant Company, The True Story of the Great Escape, Building Canada, People and Projects That Shaped the Nation, Unlikely Soldiers, How Two Canadians Fought the Secret War Against Nazi Occupation, A History of Canadian Culture, and Maple Leaf Empire, Canada, Britain, and the Two World Wars. And his most recent book is A Township at War. Please join me in our enthusiasm in welcoming, I'll stop sharing my slides, in welcoming Professor Vance.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and good evening all, whether you are here live or unlive, as the case may be. I'm going to share my screen now and get things going. You see on the screen here something that greeted Montrealers on a summer morning in 1919. Their first look at an enormous publication compiled by the daily newspaper, The Standard. It measured nearly 2 feet square, it weighed up to 4 pounds, and it featured on the front cover an idealized medieval scene that you see right here, an impressive publication to be sure. The main title proclaimed the book to be about Canada's aid to the Allies and peace memorial, but the real occasion for the publication is at the bottom, and that is victory. This was published to coincide with the signature of the Treaty of Versailles in July 1919. And on the 19th of July, Canadians would celebrate Peace Day. However, for most Canadians at the time, it was more about victory than peace. Yes, the war had ended, but more important was the fact that the war ended the right way. And so the celebration of peace was overtaken by the celebration of victory. Now, this publication that you see here was equal parts war history, photograph album, and civic boosterism. You get inside it long photographs of local units going off to war, portraits of individual soldiers. There are full-page images of Canadian landscapes. There are lots of calls to vacationers to come back to their touring. There are special sections that deal with the war effort of the various regions of the country, all of which assure readers that they are open for business. There are pages and pages of Canada's political and business leaders who praise each other for their vision, their commitment, and their all-round excellence. There are short essays by journalists describing the most thrilling episodes of the war in breathless prose. And last but certainly not least, scattered over the 152 pages are corporate honor rolls of every shape and size. Most are generic, using a template that, despite the nationalist hues of Canada's war memory, is probably American in origins. And you see it here. Some parts of it are obviously Canadian, the maple leafs at the top and on the hat and in the middle. But if you look carefully at the design, you see that the battleships are flying what looks suspiciously like the Stars and Stripes. And the artillerymen on either side look to be wearing American kit rather than Canadian. So this is probably an import. Other honor rolls, however, are unique. And not only those created by powerful firms with large advertising and art departments. This publication was part of the post-war desire to commemorate Canada's war dead. And in that activity of commemoration, virtually no group was left out. Communities were probably the most active commemorators, decorating Canada's public spaces with every manner of monument. But most other institutions got involved as well: schools, clubs, churches, hospitals, and of course, businesses. The Standard's Peace Memorial book was just one of a number of similar publications that appeared in 1919, essentially extended promotional brochures that showcased tales of heroism, business opportunities, and of course, the corporate honor roll. At the same time, companies large and small busily erected physical memorials on their premises, occasionally marble figures or sculptural groupings, more often lists of names in bronze, wood, marble, or paper. Now, in the most basic terms, a corporate war memorial was a memory aid like any other. It was a way to ensure that the names of those who had served and died were kept fresh in the collective memory. And on the surface, there wasn't much to distinguish a war memorial created by a business from a war memorial created by a school or a community group or a church. However, if you look at the subtleties, there are some unusual differences, how the names are displayed, elements of the text, nuances in the accompanying figures. These set the corporate honor roll apart. And in them, in those subtle differences, we see Canada's businesses marking the sacrifices of the war in ways that are consistent with Canada's war memory as a whole, but also make understated arguments for how the post-war world should be ordered. Now, briefly about the survival of these kinds of memorials. As war memorials go, they have actually not done very well. Some big corporations like the Bank of Commerce and the Bank of Montreal, for example, published handsome multi-volume studies, which have survived quite well. You can find most of them still in hard copy or digital form in libraries and online. Honor rolls of the kind that appeared in publications like The Standard here survived only as long as the magazine itself did. And given the fact that you can find very few copies of this publication in Canadian archival collections, one has to conclude that they didn't survive very long. Some institutions put up large and imposing memorials. Here is one on from the Canadian Pacific Railway, which erected matching memorials in Montreal and Winnipeg and in Vancouver. I'm sorry, I was blanking there for a sec. This is a typical memorial from the Bank of Nova Scotia, which was done in order to spread out the commemoration. So you'll notice it said officers of this branch. So each branch of the bank would get an identical memorial with different names to indicate the people from that branch who gave their lives. Now, sadly, as banks close, move, shift premises, whatever, these plaques have tended to disappear. This one was produced probably in the hundreds in the 1920s. At the moment, only 7 of these survive in the Bank of Nova Scotia's archives. There are others in branches that still exist, but a lot of them have simply disappeared. This is one from the Bank of Commerce. And in fact, this is a story that shows us what happens to these memorials. In 2016, this memorial plaque from a bank branch in Guelph literally resurfaced when it was dug out of a homeowner's backyard by landscapers. And fortunately, the landscapers and the homeowners realized what they had and took care of it. But this gives you an indication of how these things have been treated by time. And they've not been treated very well. Okay, so what do they say about the war as a whole? Well, it's not surprising that they tend to be very traditional. These corporate memorials see the war as a defense of goodness, a defense of God, king, and empire, a defense of the nation. The realities of the war, the industrial scale of machine killing, the futility of so many attacks, the ghastliness of the Western Front, the anonymity of modern battle, these things were rationalized or explained away or most frequently ignored altogether. In their place, we see the war's positive outcomes triumphed. The defense of eternal values, war's purifying power, the birth of a new Canadian nation. These things are highlighted to provide consolation to a generation that was trying to understand what it had just lived through. The commemorative vocabulary was very traditional, which is itself ironic. If we think of the First World War as arguably the first modern war, it tended to be described in commemorative terms by terminology from the 19th century, or even the 14th century, for medievalism was just as popular a frame of reference to understand the war as Victorianism was. And so, if you thought that the front cover of the Standards magazine was unusual in illustrating a medieval herald on horseback, not at all. This is quite common in Canada's memory of the war, to situate it within a medieval context. And in that way, it becomes another one of a long series of struggles of good over evil. In Canada's war memory, religion is omnipresent, again, usually in Christian terms of a kind of Christ-like sacrifice in defense of humanity. So all of these characteristics that we see in war memorials generally exist in corporate war memorials. For example, the religious content. And let me go back to the Canadian Pacific one for a moment. This was, as I say, designed for the Canadian Pacific Railway by a Montreal sculptor named Coeur de Leon McCarthy. And you see the Angel of Victory bearing heavenwards the fallen soldier, fallen but immaculately dressed and completely tidy. The angel holds above them the crown of laurel leaves, symbolic of the fact that immortality is his reward for a sacrifice willingly given. So this is how Canada's leading railway chose to commemorate the First World War. The Bank of Commerce originally planned a war memorial that was less overtly Christian. The first design they got from sculptor Walter Allwood, who would go on to do the memorial on Vimy Ridge. Allwood planned for the Bank of Commerce two sculptural groupings, one entitled The Service of Our Women, Healing the Scars of War, and the other entitled The Service of Our Men, Crushing the Power of the Sword. But eventually, the bank decided against that and opted instead for a massive war memorial screen on which two angels with sheathed swords kneeled facing each other on either side of an altar of sacrifice. And you see it here. So the Bank of Commerce turned away from a more secular memorial to one that was very traditional in religious terms. And you might see that the text chosen for this was a stanza from Rupert Brooke's poem, The Dead. You see it right above the door there. In terms of the inscriptions chosen for these memorials, they tended to be traditional as well. Old-fashioned literary references went along well with the 18th, 19th century or medieval imagery. These kinds of memorials did not tend towards the realistic in general, but for businesses, the realistic was an important mode for particular purposes. Here we have the plaque for the employees of Canadian Westinghouse Limited. And if you look at it in broad terms, it looks entirely classical. The quasi-ionic columns, decorated pediment, the burning altars, everything about it looks classical. But if you look right down at the bottom, it's very tiny. I'm not sure you can see it on this image. But if you look right down at the bottom, there's a highly realistic relief in the middle of Canada's soldiers and on either side of Canada's sailors and aviators. And the one in the middle particularly is surprisingly realistic, right down to the stricken landscape of shell holes and barbed wire, the charge towards enemy pillboxes, and the shattered trenches. The Bank of Montreal opted for classicism in one of its memorials. This is the classical figure that was put up in the Bank of Montreal's Montreal office. And you see there, she cradles in her arms a bundle containing palm leaves, scrolls, and a sword. and gazes sternly into the distance. Her warrior's helmet firmly on her head. Her scabbard hangs empty at her side. This is a warrior queen, if you like, entirely in the classical vein. But for Winnipeg, the Bank of Montreal office in Winnipeg, they opted for a splendidly realistic soldier bundled up in his greatcoat. His tin hat pulled firmly down over his eyes, his pistol hanging prominently at his hip. It's difficult to imagine that these two memorials are by the same corporation, but they are. This was commissioned from an American sculptor, James Earl Fraser, who used as a model a member of the bank's Winnipeg branch, who'd been in the artillery and worked as a clerk in the branch. If you're ever in Winnipeg, this is an imposing piece of statuary. The figure itself stands nearly 10 feet tall. And I think it must have delighted the bank's directors because it connected the strength and solidity of the soldier to the strength and solidity of the employer that sent them to war. The soldier represents not only the bank's soldiers, but the bank itself. Also, in this commemorative culture, size mattered. Communities used long lists of names in an almost competitive fashion to demonstrate that they had cultivated a keen sense of civic obligation in residence. Most communities were very concerned that their honor roll be as long as, or preferably just a little bit longer than, the neighboring village, church, school, or town. For a church, for example, the longer the honor roll, the stronger the evidence of a devout and faithful congregation. The size of a school's honor roll was indicative of how successfully the teachers had been in educating their pupils on citizenship. And for businesses, this was just as important. It wasn't just about showing up one's neighbors. It was about upholding the reputation of the business in the process. So a corporate honor roll spoke to the caliber of the workers, but it also spoke to the caliber of the company. It was imperative to convey this impression of solidity and stability, like this soldier does. And in this regard, realism was useful. Classical symbols were also useful in providing a sense of timelessness. So here we have a memorial by the Bell Telephone Company for its Montreal employees. Again, austere classical columns, a pediment adorned with maple leaves, the company's logo. This cries out respectability and solidity. The Steel Company of Canada in Hamilton. Again, we have decorated classical columns, a pediment above with the nation's coat of arms in it, and throughout this impression of substance and strength and timelessness created by these classical images. Eaton's in Toronto commissioned these two enormous bronze plaques, which are now in the Canadian War Museum. These were commissioned for the flagship Toronto store, which shows the women who are identified as the figure of Canada, because the shield she holds bears the coats of arms of the provinces. But everything else about her is classical, from her drapery to the laurel wreath on her head to the palm frond she holds over the names. And so again, the classical vocabulary is all about solidity, quality, and seriousness. The message was that only the best employers attracted workers with a highly developed sense of civic duty and responsibility, qualities that they could hone further still in wartime. The suggestion was that companies like that put country and empire above profit because they were willing to send so many workers to war rather than using their corporate influence to keep these men and women out of uniform. And for this reason, employers were very keen to say how many of its best and brightest workers had volunteered for service, because that simple calculation gave you the quality of the company. After all, how many businesses were willing to admit that their workers had showed a shocking lack of patriotism by refusing to enlist? What store wanted its customers to know that they were being served by sales clerks who valued their comfort more than king and empire? Certainly not the T. Eaton Company, which prefaced its published honor roll with the assurance for customers that it had a significant number of ex-soldiers in its employment. The preface reads, and I quote, "There are not many young men of military age around Eaton's who are not wearing the active service button." After all, who wants to buy stuff by being sold by men who ignored the nation's call? So businesses took every opportunity to emphasize the length of their honor rolls by various means. In the Montreal Standard's publication, the use of a full-page honor roll with column after column of names printed in close text left a powerful impression of the scale of the company's contribution and its sense of civic responsibility. In other cases, it was sufficient just to provide the appropriate statistics without necessarily giving the names to make manifest the size of the contribution. For example, the British Columbia Land Surveyors pointed out in its memorial volume, and I quote, "Out of a total membership of about 250, it is known that 129 enlisted in the various branches of His Majesty's service, including, as far as is known, every able-bodied man of military age and many, though over age, who could not be deterred from answering the call." So one is left to assume that the only land surveyors who didn't enlist were people who were old or infirm. But that wasn't quite enough. Businesses also were careful to say that no matter how long their published honor roll actually was, the real honor roll was in fact longer, simply because they hadn't been able to secure the desired information. So the Canadian Pacific Railway began publishing honor rolls early in the war, always with a kind of caveat, a reminder that the list only captured part of the company's human contribution. And this is what their caveat said. "As particulars of Army reservists are not available, these lists of those who have given up their lives for the country or been wounded in action are necessarily incomplete and do not therefore indicate fully the extent to which the company's officers and employees have participated in the great struggle." And I think if you read between the lines, the implication is clear. What the Canadian Pacific Railway was saying is that our competitors' honor roll may look longer than ours, but that's only because we have so many soldier workers who are not in fact listed. Now, if this kind of commemoration was about size, there was also the factor of leveling. Much of the commemorative impulse of the First World War was about leveling and democratization. Everyone was to be regarded as equal in death. No one person's sacrifice was greater or more significant than anyone else's. And this was fine for most of Canada. But for corporate Canada, this was problematic. The war years had seen increasingly fractious relations between management and labor, with unions becoming ever bolder in calling on their members to down tools in pursuit of a fair deal. The injunction to direct all their energies towards beating the Hun rather than squabbling on the home front had been powerful early years in the war, but by 1916, it was starting to become a little hollow. By then, it was becoming clear that some employers were doing pretty well out of the war, but were not interested in sharing the wealth with their workers. So labor discontent simmered in 1917 and 1918, before things came to a boiling point in 1919 with a season of unparalleled labor radicalism and strike action. Just when workers were shaking the very foundations of Canadian corporate life, companies began to produce their war memorials. What better time, I think, to use the corporate memorial as a way to bolster the capitalist hierarchy? A war memorial could remind workers where they belonged. You make it clear that their predecessors who gave their lives in uniform knew where they belonged. And so workers in the present and future should know their place. These memorials drew clear lines between those who owned and managed and those who merely worked. And perhaps most importantly, these memorials could tie loyalty in the workplace to loyalty to the nation, affirming that labor action was a kind of treason just as it was presented during the Winnipeg General Strike and other flashpoints. So in the fraught atmosphere of post-war Canada, the memory of the war could be mobilized in all of its varied manifestations, from Armistice Day parades to war memorials, to oppose what were known at the time as quote-unquote subversive elements. Now, if we look at commemoration this way, things that might seem benign in other contexts take on different overtones. For example, it was quite common in corporate commemoration to attach, or in commemoration generally, to attach group insignias or symbols, the coat of arms of a village or town, the motto of a school, something like that. This was a way to affirm that however much these individuals were fighting for Canada and Empire, they were also fighting for their hometown or their home school or their home church. But the addition of a corporate symbol to a business war memorial was a little different, because it drew a connection between the loyalty that a soldier showed to his country and the loyalty he ought to show to his employer. Now, this might be a corporate crest, or in the case of this honor roll to the Montreal Trust Company, an image of corporate headquarters to draw the connection between the worker soldier and the corporation. You might find that the war memorial features the company's products. So this one from the George Foss Manufacturing Company tells you very little except what it produces. The names of the three soldiers are squeezed in there between the various kinds of machine tools. Or even more interestingly, the Roll of Honor for W.H. Banfield and Sons, which lists the shells, fuses, cartridge clips, and primers it had manufactured during the war. And in the middle is the honor roll. Now, you may find this distasteful to modern sensibilities, but contemporaries were obviously less troubled by an advertisement, a war memorial, that honored the dead by showcasing the very products that had been used to kill other young men, albeit other young men from the other side. Canadian General Electric used its 1919 annual report to shareholders as the occasion to present its honor roll. And it began by saying this: "Your directors believe that our shareholders will be much interested in having placed before them information as to the number of men previously employed by the company who enlisted for service in the Canadian Army." Again, the connection between corporate quality and the number of volunteers. And furthermore, to reassure investors of the sense of civic duty that was shown by laborers across the country, at the very time, 1919, when investors might be looking nervously at strikers around them, it was pointed out by Canadian General Electric that similar patriotic sacrifices were made by industrial workers throughout the Dominion. Again, the country may be consumed by general strikes, but don't worry, our workers are sound and solid and patriotic. Even more interesting is this honor roll by the Bank of Hamilton. It's got the standard graphic art at the top, but I think you probably, like me, will find that your eye was immediately drawn not by the list of names at the bottom, but to the larger headline above them, which proclaimed capital paid up $3 million, surplus $3.5 million. Now, whether this was intentional or not, the implication is unfortunate, that the men of the bank had served and died for Canada and the British Empire, but also served and died for a healthy bottom line. Also, corporate war memorials typically conformed to the practice of highlighting the dead, but they diverged in the tendency to separate names by other criteria. In the vast majority of memorials across the country, there's no distinction between officers and other ranks. This is not the case in corporate honor rolls. Simply put, in corporate honor rolls, rank mattered to employers. Officers almost always appeared first in the honor roll, or on rolls that were alphabetical, it was common to include officers' ranks so that the readers knew how many of them had risen above the masses. The R. Forbes Company, which was a manufacturer of woolen goods in Hespeler, affirmed its commitment to democratization by saying, quote, "Our list does not show the rank of the men." So you might think that it's going to treat all of its volunteers the same. But it immediately undercut that idealism by pointing out that many of its employees eventually became officers. The implication is that Forbes was a firm that hired only the best men. Men were fit for more than just laboring in the ranks. There were other ways of affirming this hierarchy, the hierarchy of rank, whether it be social or military. Dow Lalonde was a Montreal tannery and footwear manufacturer. Hall Manufacturing was another, or Hall Engineering Works was another Montreal corporation, both of which placed advertisements in the Standard's Victory issue. In both cases, these companies listed just one single person on their honor roll. And in each case, that person was the son of the president. Now, both of these corporations, Dow Lalonde and Hall Engineering, these were both large corporations. And it's inconceivable that each sent only a single person to war. Nevertheless, in these two companies, at least, mentioning the honor roll was dependent on lineage and rank. Despite the common principle, all were not equal in death. And these sorts of memorials tell us that the sons of company presidents were just a little more equal than everyone else. So corporate war memorials then tend to buttress the social hierarchy, but they also affirm the wisdom of that act by extending it outwards towards the nation as a whole. And in a not so subtle way, they combine loyalty to company and loyalty to country in ways that the two became almost inseparable. And here's one from Union Station. It's still on the wall in Union Station, Toronto, so if you pass by there, you can see it. You have in this design a kind of impression of the entire nation marching forward. The soldiers, the tanks, the horses, the railway engines, the ships, directed above by the patriotic figures. This is the scene of a great national exercise. Or take the statement that accompanied the Bank of Hamilton's honor roll that was published in the Standard's Victory issue. And let me read this. It's a few sentences long, but it's interesting in expressing what businesses were trying to achieve. The fine spirit displayed by the men of Canadian banks at the time of its empire's need was not caused by the war, it was merely made manifest. It's the same spirit that before the call to arms found its expression in unswerving loyalty to the institutions with which they were connected. Institutions that attract such men and foster their self-reliant manhood may claim to be worthy representatives of Canadian business practices. Our men have been a credit to their progenitors, to Canada, to their employers, and to themselves. We are proud of them, and still more proud to feel that the banking business of Canada has been in the past, and trust it will be in the future, in the hands of honorable men of proven worth. Some of them will never return to Canada, and those of us who remain to carry on their work will find in their memory an inspiration to stand steadfast for integrity and public service. So what the Bank of Hamilton was saying is that these men were always great. It was simply that the coming of war gave them the opportunity to mobilize their quote unquote unswerving loyalty to the company and turn it instead to the nation. Now, once the war has been won, the enemy has been vanquished, that loyalty can return to its natural focus. It can return to loyalty to the company because that's what's essential in peacetime. So in 1919, when many of these memorials are being created, the weight of history and the memory of the dead compelled soldier bankers, in this case, to turn their backs on labor agitation, on political experimentation, on social innovation, and focus their loyalty where it should be, on the company, and secondly, on the country. Okay, summer of 1919. The war had been over for less than a year. Thousands of Canadian soldiers remained overseas, wouldn't be back in Canada until later on that summer. The war against influenza was still in full swing, and it was anyone's guess as to the extent of the economic, social, and political upheavals that the war had brought in its wake. So the war brings, yes, celebration and release and gladness that it's all over, but also a climate of uncertainty and worry facing a future that they can't quite imagine. And in this uncertainty and worry, Commemoration served as an anchor. It allowed Canadians to face this uncertain future by laying down a simple and comforting interpretation of the recent past. Convinced that they knew full well where they had just been, Canadians might convince themselves that they also knew where they were going, or at the very least, that they could cope with any challenges that might come their way. This is how society as a whole viewed things. But for Canada's businesses, I think the thinking was very much along the same lines, and perhaps even more pointed. No one could deny that Canada's businesses had answered the nation's call fully and enthusiastically, but there were nagging questions about whether some companies had profited unduly from wartime pressures. Were there profiteers? Were there manufacturers, financiers who'd made just a little bit too much money out of war contracts? That was a possibility, and in many people's minds, virtually a probability. At the same time, for businesses, labor disruptions conjured up an uncertain future in which workers might be less pliable than in the past. And this was difficult because business had thrived on the fact that workers were relatively easy to push around in this country. And if the war had given them a greater level of self-reliance, self-determination, a greater level of independence, that was not what Canada's businesses wanted to hear. They wanted to have their workers return to the old days in which they did what they were told and didn't complain about it. So in the struggle of businesses to readjust to a new world, the War Memorial was a minor but not inconsequential tool. And this is why it provides an interesting slice of commemoration generally. It is a subset of Commemoration Canada broadly, but it has its own unique features. Because clearly businesses used these in a very carefully calculated way. They knew full well the images they were choosing, the text they were choosing, the graphics they were choosing, the impression they wanted to give. These things were not done accidentally or coincidentally. These memorials were done with a purpose in mind. And it was an opportunity that businesses took advantage of. By putting their message into a memorial, businesses could almost guarantee that it was going to get looked at a little more carefully than it might otherwise have done. Everyone was interested in commemoration. Everyone was interested in who was putting up what plaques. And so people were going to pay more attention to a business memorial than they would to an annual report or an advertisement. At the same time, though, businesses recognized that they could make these statements in their memorials and be relatively safe. They could capitalize on the public's deep reservoir of goodwill where the war dead were concerned to ensure that their messages did not get a rough ride. After all, who is going to criticize a memorial? There are lots of critiques of war commemoration in the future, but in 1919, it took a rare nerve to criticize a commemorative venture, regardless of the reason. So no one was going to step up and call businesses on what they were saying in their plaques. They would simply be shouted down by fingers pointing at the honor roll. And so, just to close, the corporate war memorial allowed employers to take advantage of the times to make a very important public statement. They could lay down their own vision, both of the past and of the future. They could validate the lessons of the war memory as a whole, while at the same time they could stake a claim for their own particular understanding of the war's legacy. And as far as corporate war memorials were concerned, the First World War proved nothing more convincingly than the desirability of continuing to do things the way they had always been done. Thank you very much, everyone.
Jonathan, that was excellent. So great. I am going to just wrap us up while we wait to see if we have some comments or questions, and I will just share my slides.
If I can just take this opportunity to, because I have an audience, we know that a lot of these smaller private memorials are at risk. There's been you see a lot of things in newspapers and the media about church war memorials as churches are closed and repurposed, and the memorials are in some cases disappearing. It's the same with businesses, with corporate institutions. So I would ask everyone to keep their eyes open in their community. And if one of these lovely little plaques is there one day but not there the next, ask around before it ends up in a thrift shop on eBay, or even worse, at a scrap metal bin at a foundry. I've been lucky enough to be able to save a dozen or so First World War memorials from schools and churches, which is great, but I have probably missed saving 10 times that many. So we need all eyes out there to community to watch for these things.
For sure. Yes, that's a great, great point.
And then we can send them all to museums like yours, and they can be
we do have a few
retained for future.
We definitely have a few in our collection here, like the one that was in the slide kind of advertisement was one from our collection. So anyway, as we wait for the any additional comments in the chat, I'm just going to give our quick ending kind of thoughts. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please consider making a donation to the museum so we can continue to deliver the high quality programming that you expect from us. As I mentioned earlier, we really appreciate any donation you're able to make, and you can either give us a call at the museum at 905-984-8880 or visit our donation portal on our active STC page to make a donation. And the link to the portal was included in the VMLS email that you would have received to get the link for tonight's presentation. And your donation does make a difference, and we thank you for that. We'd also like to remind everyone, maybe if I can follow, there we go, to please like, follow, and subscribe on all of our social media channels, including here on YouTube, on WordPress, and on our podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy our content, please share it in all your networks to help more of our community join in the historical adventures. And as I mentioned, coming up next on the virtual lecture series in 2 weeks is me, which with the presentation in the public interest, public works in St. Catharines between the world wars. And it's a lecture about the interwar period in St. Catharines. And it'll talk about, how St. Catharines changed during that time period. Oh, there's my slide for that. And I'll stop sharing. The virtual lecture series is produced by the St. Catharines Museum and the Welland Canal Center and the City of St. Catharines. So I actually have a question for you related to war memorials in general, but I'm interested in whether this impacted corporate war memorials as well. Was there a backlash eventually? Because, there's this idea that you mentioned about rationalization and just death and all of those things. But after they had time, like people in the community and in the country had time to kind of process this enormity of what had happened, say, a few years or so. Was there any sort of backlash from the war memorial perspective? I know that there was some in literature became a lot darker after kind of, a few years of having time to kind of process it. But how did that impact war memorials and how memorialization just occurred in Canada in general?
It had very little impact, actually. The big burst of commemoration was right after the war, but it continues through the interwar period. And in fact, the last major war memorial unveiled in the country, as far as I know, is in Welland there. And it looks a bit different. It's a kind of has a kind of neo-Soviet feel to it. But in terms of its the way it presents the war, it's entirely traditional. After the Second World War, when you've got another war to commemorate, and they have to discuss what they're going to do in terms of functional or aesthetic memorials, there's really very little questioning of the First World War memorials. And when they are they do become targets of a sort in the 60s during the Vietnam era, it's as an expression of current discontents, not any judgment about the war itself. So there is still in this country a very strong residual feeling that the war memorial is a substitute gravestone. And whatever your political feelings or emotional, however you regard the person who's buried under the headstone, you don't deface or mess up the headstone. So they have they were able to escape a lot of that critique that came after. The other thing that has to be said is, in some places that was because they were almost forgotten, because a memorial that was in the perfect place in 1919 may not be in the perfect place in 1939. So as cities change and people move and memorials stay the same, their usage changes. And so if they're no longer in a public traffic area, people just miss them. And so they're more likely to be ignored than become the targets of any kind of critique.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that. I did a little bit of a survey in the community when we did our World War I exhibit here in St. Catharines of war memorials in churches around our community. And often I would go to a church and ask them if I could come in and photograph their war memorials. And often the person I spoke to on the phone didn't know they had war memorials in their church, even though they were there every week, sometimes every day. Interestingly,
some of the biggest proponents of what I would call monumental vandalism are in churches in the 80s and 90s, with people who don't like the connection between the church and militarism.
Oh, right.
And so in Hamilton, where I lived years ago, there was a church that had a lovely oak carved commemorative screen, and it had on it a crusader with a sword. And at some point, someone in the church decided that this was too militaristic a symbol, and so they went in with power tools and cut out the sword from this gorgeous oak sculpted memorial. So that sort of thing happens, but fortunately, I guess in some cases it's good to be ignored, I suppose.
It's really interesting, the pictures you showed of a lot of these corporate war memorials. The ones I photographed of the churches in St. Catharines were very similar. They had the same kind of look to them, with the columns and the flags in the top, and often the flaming kind of altar type of idea. They looked almost identical. I mean, maybe it was just maybe there were only a small number of companies making these war memorials, but they were very similar to the ones that were being used that you showed pictures of from banks and that kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, you can find war memorial catalogs from this era. So you can pick your design features. And you're right, there's not a lot of brass or iron foundries that can deal with that kind of work. And it becomes a very profitable line. And they're able to sell to the public the fact that, look, you don't need any artistic knowledge. We'll do the design work. You just give us the text and we'll take care of it.
Yeah, that makes
Uh,
sense.
and so that part of the economy really does well in commemoration.
So I do have a couple questions. Firstly, we have a couple of comments. One is from Brian, who said, "Interesting talk. We have, as you know, you may or may not know, we have our war memorials located on the front of our city hall for our community that have the list of the war dead from the First and the Second World War, actually from all of conflicts our community has participated in. And of course, we have, because of it being an amalgamated community here in St. Catharines, we have several cenotaphs here. One that has a soldier, a stone soldier on it in Meriton, and then of course we have a couple of kind of like large stone cenotaphs as well. And then we have a comment from Kay Holden, who says the War Memorial for British home children killed in World War I was originally located at the Canadian head office of Dr. Bernardo's Homes. And they've said have been able to locate it in their archives in England. So if you're looking for that.
It was repatriated at some point. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's interesting where some of these things end up over the years. You
know,
they get moved around. Yeah.
Well, at least they know where it is.
Exactly. Did have a question about are there any good examples of corporate memorials that are buildings? So here in St. Catharines, Ridley College, private school here, built a chapel, a memorial chapel that is for all their war dead now, but started out as a memorial to their First World War dead. Did any corporations do something similar to that?
That's a really interesting question. I would have to say no. Not on a big scale that, say, universities did, or hospitals or that sort of thing. And I'm not sure why that. I'm not sure why that is. I think a part of it may be that even before the war, if you were to look at envelopes that were used by businesses, often they will have the picture of their building in the corner. And the building is a demonstration of the excellence of the company. And so I think they had a lot of goodwill invested in their premises already. And putting up a new one as a memorial, I think would have maybe didn't seem to make sense. That's a very good question. I'll have to think about that, but I can't think of any offhand where you see small scale things where a company will make a club room or a lounge or something as a war memorial. But to erect something specific in a kind of corporate sense, I cannot think of a single one in this country.
That's interesting. I know after the Second World War, there were a lot of civic buildings that were built as memorials to the Second World War, as opposed to, building cenotaphs that already existed. And so it is an interesting question.
And I mean, part of the impulse after the Second World War was the realization that they already had all these First World War memorials. So do we actually need more metal soldiers or pieces of granite? But part of it was also practical, because the Second World War revealed the appalling state of public health in this country. And so the idea that you would create what were called civic utilities as memorials, so parks and pools and gymnasiums and all these things, they could memorialize, but they also helped to build a healthier nation, which was part of the thinking behind them also.
Another question we had was, who paid for these memorials? I know that there were some memorials in different places that were paid for by subscription of, the citizens who were involved, but corporate memorials must have been somewhat different in that perspective.
Yeah, and for community memorials, the payment by subscription was actually a big philosophy behind it, because much was made of the fact that everyone from the community or the church or whatever contributed. So it was very much an expression of group will. And this is why, for example, you see so many war memorial cairns in this country, particularly in rural areas, because it allowed people not only to contribute financially, but also in some communities to bring the stones from their farm that served as the cairn. So it was very much a group effort. But for corporations, no, these were business expenses. And in this Montreal Standard thing, these came from the advertising budget. Probably everything came from the advertising budget because they had this agenda, I think, that ran parallel with Commemoration. So it was a public relations exercise, and I don't mean that in a I don't want to slag the businesses altogether, but I think they were fairly clear about what they were doing.
For sure. Yeah. It seems that way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually kind of interesting because there are still very similar types of things as this standard kind of magazine that today often a news outlet will call around Remembrance Day asking for businesses to put an ad in the paper that memorializes or remembers or what, uses that same terminology we use around Remembrance Day, but with your name of your business on it. So
exactly.
Using it for advertising. Yeah.
And as you're right, it exists to this day.
Yeah. Let me see if we have any other questions. Lots of comments about how interesting lecture and a couple of examples of memorial buildings here in the community. We have a memorial school and Edith Cavell School. So buildings that were built later, but memorializing the war afterwards. So
and the big challenge, even at the time with memorials like that, was if you build a school or a hospital, people recognized that at some point it would go out of date. And so you're faced with the awkward decision of, do you have to pull down your memorial? And this is difficult for communities. It's in England after the First World War, it was very popular to put up hospitals as war memorials. And perhaps more than anything else, hospitals are susceptible to the passage of time because technology changes. So many war memorial hospitals in Britain had to be demolished because they simply couldn't be used anymore. So that was a consideration even when these things were being built, whether they were actually going to survive in the long term. And of course, the very purpose of a memorial is to ensure the survival of the memory. And if it gets pulled down, it's not really doing its job.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that looks like our comments and questions. I just want to say thank you once again on behalf of all of our audience and the museum for coming on and sharing your research about corporate war memorials from the First World War. Really appreciate it. And again, I'll give a shout out to our audience to go out and buy your books because they're excellent, and
thank you.
Take some time to read about it. I find the topic of memorializing and memory of warfare just to be super interesting personally, and I think that it's just something people are not always. It's always there. Like there's all this iconography around Remembrance Day, which we're coming upon soon, all comes from this period, and I think that we just, because it's always been there for us, we don't see it as something new and interesting at the time, and so hopefully people will go out and take a look.
I mean, the fun thing is that it's always changing. So the interesting thing about memory studies is that we don't recall an event, we recall the memory of an event. So every time we recall it, it's different. So the First World War had, after November 11th, 1918, it continued to have a living existence in the minds of people who remembered it differently every time they remembered it. So it means that it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. And gives historians an endless supply of material to work with.
Thank you so much. And
my pleasure. It's good to see you again, Kathleen.
You too. Take it easy. Have a great night.
You too. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.